Is it doing it?
Click, recording. There we go.
Okay. Um, so thinking about education in the future, I guess generally. So I think there's a building realization that education is a little too standardized at this point. We've really started more and more teaching to tests. It's something that definitely was going on when I was going through high school. Is teachers that people found very inspiring were actually getting phased out because they were getting kids to think and they were getting kids essentially to want to educate themselves, but the test scores weren't necessarily reflecting that because they didn't want to sit kids down and have them just churn through chapter after chapter of American history. They wanted to have good discussions about American history or American political systems and that sort of thing. And I think that's definitely starting to be realized and frowned upon in a lot of cases.
Wait, what's being frowned upon?
Over standardization, overly teaching to tests.
Okay.
Basically, emphasizing content in education over growing the individual.
Okay.
Right? Because when you put
sure.
kids through school, there's two different parts to that. There's sort of teaching them how to be better people, how to do critical thinking, how to teach themselves problem solving. And then we have this information, we need to put it into you. I think both of those things have places in the education system, but at least in my experience in America, it's shifting much more towards content and away from betterment of the individual. And I think that's being realized, and you see that in Montessori schools. There's sort of a lot of backlash against that sort of standardization. And then when you go into the realm of games, there have been some very educational games, especially the old ones. There's Math Blaster and things like that.
Yeah.
But there's also been a lot of failures, and to the point where if you pitch to a publisher I've got this game, and then you say educational, your pitch probably just failed. Sort of the impression that I get is it's very hard to say I'm going to make a successful game, the goal of which is to teach math or anything like that. But on the flip side, I think there are a lot of games that are very educational, almost by not trying to be. One of the games that has taught me the most out of any game or really media is Civilization, because you play Civilization and then you care about it, and it just puts opportunities everywhere. Do you want to learn about, ancient Korean artillery? Yeah, kind of, because I'm murdering all these people. I want to know how I'm doing that.
Yeah.
And all the world wonders and all these things. I've learned a ton from that game.
Have you seen the extra credits video on this topic?
No.
Oh, they have one. They come up with a phrase for it. I think they call it incidental education or something like that.
Sure, that sounds right.
Yeah.
And I know that, I was just on this Click project, and we were presented with a problem, and the problem was not girls need help being educated. They need some tool to help them catch up with boys because they're not learning physics well enough. The problem was the girls don't want to learn physics. That's the thing that we need to fix. And I think that's true in our specific problem of girls not being interested in STEM topics. But I think it's also the problem in education. I don't think our education system has a huge problem with not being able to get math into kids' heads. The problem is they don't care about math. They'll learn a lot faster and a lot more on their own if they want to. And so specifically when you're talking about educational games, the games we made in Click, we made sure that they were educational in the sense that if you look at them, there's stuff there to be learned. And we sort of populated the website with incidental information around them. But, we made it very clear with some objection from faculty that we were not, these games were not teaching a curriculum. You were never going to come out of one of these and be able to answer a test. So we didn't care about that. We cared about, does the player now care a little bit more about physics? Are they going to be interested in this and pursue that? As far as the actual education system goes, I'm not so sure about that because we're always going to have tests, right? What drives getting into college, there's international considerations and that sort of thing. But games have never been a primary mode of education, but people have always wanted to get them into the educational system because they're something that kids love. And I feel that if things like Click are successful, in the future people are going to realize, games are great for education, but not in the teaching for tests sort of way. If you want to do that in school, great, there are systems to do that. But if you want to use games to get children better educated, what you're going to want to do is build games that inspire children to educate themselves or make them more excited about what they're learning in school so they're more receptive to the information.
Okay, so that makes sense. Is there any kind of concrete prediction that can come out of this?
Well, so it depends a little bit on how much things get picked up on. But with the increasing frequency of like social games like Facebook games and also sort of independent websites like the Click website, um, I would predict that within the next 10 years or so, you're going to see a lot less games that advertise this will teach your children math or this will get them ready for the SATs.
Well, do we see that many right now?
I think we see like a lot of attempts at them.
I,
Like,
I know there's a lot of people who yak about it and talk about doing it, but like, I don't know any retail shelves
well,
or
okay, so then what I would say is there's a lot of people who want those games to exist. I mean, groups like the MacArthur Foundation and the Science Center, like people who
uh-huh.
want to utilize games to do this thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of that yakking is directed towards the traditional educational game. And I think a lot of the reason we don't see those games is because they're, I mean, sort of fundamentally flawed in a lot of ways. I would say in about 10 years, we're going to see a lot more games, whether or not they're retail games or like free to play online.
Yeah.
We'll see a lot more games actually being made that are sort of incidental education games because people will start to realize these are successful at what they're trying to do. Like once people start to get away from the idea of, okay, how are we going to teach this chapter of math inside this game and
Okay.
start thinking, like I think those
So
things are going to be
so
successful.
you're predicting a rise in incidental education games.
Yes.
Do you see those as part of the entertainment market, or will they be part of a formal education system in any way?
Kind of both, but mostly not part of. I think they'll be used by a formal education system, but I think it will be detrimental to them to be formally associated. Like I think a lot of these
Right.
things, teachers will love them and want to bring them into their classrooms, and that's great. But I think as soon as they start being funded by the education system,
Mm-hmm.
like I don't have anything against the education system, but because it has to be so standardized,
Okay.
it'll end up pushing a lot in that will
Well,
make them
well,
not
let me
successful.
let me ask this. I mean, why don't we? I mean, why do you think there's going to be a rise? What will be the factor driving a rise in incidental education games?
Well, A hopefully is success. Like once some start to get out there, I think they will be successful. Um, I kind of feel like right now is when they're starting. Like I start to see these things popping up. I mean, partially because I was working on one, but I start to see these games coming about. A that are free to play,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean, part of it was it used to be with retail,
Mhm.
the the walls were high. It was a difficult market to enter because of retail. Now that we
Yes,
have downloadable markets, the barriers are low, so
yes,
it means people can try more experiments. So I think that's part of
and
it.
it means that groups that are like nonprofit, things like science foundations and things like that, can try them and put them out there for free, um,
Okay.
with grants. Whereas I don't know how that would have worked in like a retail market. Like,
Right. No, I remember back. I remember talking to a guy up at Dartmouth who'd made this amazing game that taught certain things to medical students. Um, but this was pre-internet, really, and
mhm,
distributing his game was like this huge problem. How
yeah,
are you going to get it to people? You got to press all these discs. It's very expensive. People got to work into their curriculum. Blah blah blah.
right,
Whereas if it had just been a downloadable, it would have been a very different story.
right.
So
And the reason why I say like 10 years from now is partially just because I think it'll take that long to catch on. The other thing is something I was very aware of during this project is there wasn't really a good way to evaluate ourselves because if you make a game that's like teach this chapter of a physics textbook, then after they play the game you can test that chapter of the physics textbook. But we're trying to generate interest and inspiration, which is something that you're not going to see for a while.
yeah,
I feel like if we're making games that target kids in elementary school and middle school, then I don't think there's going to be a lot of like formal longitudinal studies, but you'll start to sort of get that buzz 4 or 5 years down the line of people starting to say like, yeah, I'm doing really well in this field, and oh, remember these games that I played, and so you'll start to get almost like a viral marketing thing, just sort of representing that those did have an impact on these people. Because I don't think we can get that right away, and I think once people who have been affected by the things that are currently coming out start showing that it had an impact on their lives, then people will be more willing to actually develop these things in a serious way because they'll know that they're not just exercises and experimentation.
right. Okay. Well, how do you think we can measure this? So the idea is I would call you to task in the year
Sure.
2021, and we would see whether
2021.
there'd been a significant rise in incidental education games. Can you think of anything that would be measurable where we could kind of see whether this was right or not?
I don't know enough about like statistics or market to make a concrete prediction, but what I would say is I think that by like 2021, we will see at least a few games, probably free to play, whose stated purpose is education, but probably like incidental education, that are well known. Like that are not niche things, like sort of along the lines of like Dofus,
Million players?
maybe between them. Um, I mean, I would say that like I would say there'll be a couple of games that have like 100,000 like player base that's consistently signing into them and using them.
Okay, I think that's good. So 100,000. There will be at least one game with 100,000 players.
Yeah.
That is an incidental education
Yes.
game. Now,
Whether or not that's apparent, like, see, that's the thing is like,
you get into a question. I mean, you could argue that World of Warcraft is an incidental education game.
I mean, the people behind the game intended it that way. Whether or not
Got
they're
it.
marketing it that way to their audience,
All right. Well, that's a very easy one to measure. So by the
just
year,
ask them.
by the year 2021,
Mhm.
there will be one game. There will be at least one game with 100,000 players that is an intentionally incidental. It is an
Yes.
that is an intentionally incidentally
Educational
educational
game.
game.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
No problem.